If you're looking for a superfood to grow, it's hard to beat blackberries. They can be grown in just about every state in the United States. They're highly adaptable, and they thrive in USDA zones from 4 all the way up through 10. Here in California, we're USDA Zone 9, and they do quite well here. They grow nearly anywhere that has enough sun. But some states, I must admit, are particularly well suited for cultivation due to their specific climates. If you talk to anybody from Oregon and Washington, they will claim they have the best blackberries in the world, and they just might. And in fact, in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, they are the leading commercial producer of blackberries in the United States. Here in California, they thrive in the Central Coast, in the valleys, the San Joaquin Valley and the Sacramento Valley, due to fertile soils and temperate conditions. North Carolina has a big commercial blackberry industry. They offer a warm climate and ample rainfall. Down in Arkansas, Arkansas is actually home to major breeding programs for caneberries like blackberries at the University of Arkansas, and they've developed many popular varieties. Tennessee, it's known for its rich loamy soils and moderate temperatures that support healthy growth. And Georgia is excellent for heat-tolerant varieties. And there are cold-hardy varieties, too, for the folks in the Midwest and the Northeast. Illini Hardy comes to mind as a very cold-hardy variety that you don't need to think about growing here unless you're living up in Truckee. Anyway, we'll talk about blackberries today with Sacramento County Master Gardener and berry expert and a guy with a perfect disc jockey name. Jeff Smoker is with us. Jeff, it's a pleasure talking with you here on the Beyond the Garden Basics podcast and newsletter.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate the introduction, and it's great to be with you today.
Give us a little bit about your background, because I know you've been a teacher and you're very enthusiastic about growing blackberries and all berries.
Sure. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and my earliest memories of gardening have to do with spitting watermelon seeds out into the garden and then watching the vines as they multiplied and grew and produced these wonderful, enormous fruits. That kindled my desire and passion for gardening, and it extends all the way through for many, many years into a wide variety of year-round cultivation, including berries. Now, quick story about berries is that when our kids were younger, now just to give you a frame of reference, their oldest is 45 and youngest is 34. In that, we took our kids to Watsonville for annual outings to Gizditch Ranch, where we picked abundant pounds and pounds, 50, 60, 70 pounds of blackberries and also strawberries, alali berries in particular. And those were an introduction into berries, and then gave me that desire not only to be able to pick at a U-pick area, but also to have them in our backyard.
For people who don't know where Watsonville is, it's in the San Francisco Bay Area, well, south of the San Francisco Bay Area, in a very fertile region with a very mild climate. It's not too far from the Pacific Ocean, so that it is one of the areas. It's one of the country's top growing regions, especially for leafy green vegetables. And I could see how berries and blackberries would do quite well in that area.
Yes, not only did they do well in that area, but I took matters into my own hands with having abundant vines in our backyard. And I mainly stuck with alalis because, of course, the memories of growing up with them, but also because they are abundant producers of fruit. They are the canes, and we'll get into more specifics about canes and how they grow. They were just wonderful to have through the seasons. An abundant harvest coming up in mid-May through the middle of June, and that was it. But when they came in, they were hot and heavy, and we got a lot of berries. Plenty for eating, plenty for making berry cobblers, jamming, you name it. We have done everything with berries.
I mentioned that blackberries are considered a superfood, and according to North Carolina State University, a superfood is so called because it has a high ratio of nutrients to calories. Blackberries are low in fat and sodium. They make a very heart healthy snack. They're loaded with fiber, 7.6 grams per 100 per cup. Only 62 calories per cup. Carbohydrates, 13 or 14 grams. Less than 7 grams of sugar. Less than 1 gram of fat. And even has 2 grams of protein. Plus, it's loaded with vitamin C, manganese, vitamin K, vitamin E, potassium. It's high in antioxidants, which reduce free radicals, combat oxidative stress, and may protect against cancer, heart disease, and cognitive decline. I need more of that in my life. But then I've been eating my breakfast every day with a bowl of berries on top of the cereal, including blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries. I think I've maintained my mind somewhat.
Yes, you have indeed.
Now, in your past, you were a school teacher. Were you able
Yes.
to work in some berry love for your students?
Not specifically with students, with gardening with our own children, with the neighbors, and sharing the abundant harvest that we had. So, not necessarily with students in the classroom.
I would imagine anybody that came over and visited your house, especially during the summer when it's peak blackberry season, they left impressed, I bet.
Definitely. And what we were noted for in our neighborhood in Santa Clara prior to moving to Sacramento, we have been in Sacramento now for about 2 years. And prior to that, had resided in Santa Clara. In the Santa Clara home, I converted all of our front lawn, which was monoculture grass, to a thriving, vibrant garden and incredible ecosystem right there in the front yard. Our blackberries were in the backyard area, and so I would frequently give tours to those who would walk by and see the beauty of the garden and share with them the wonder of gardening.
Well, first of all, congratulations for not living in an area with an HOA, and thanks for giving people tours. I think people, if they have a front yard garden, it doesn't happen that often, but still, passersby may say, "Well, what if the front looks like this? What does the back look like?" Well, come on in. Let's take a
Yes.
look. Yes.
That's exactly it. It was an invitation, not only an invitation to see the yard, but also an inspiration for those who might convert their front yard. And in our neighborhood, in which we lived for 24 years, it was delightful to see the front yard gardens popping up in different places. And I thought that's an organic approach to gardening, and it works so well.
It's a very desirable weed that spreads, the beauty of the front
Yes,
yard
indeed.
garden. Plus, you're attracting all sorts of pollinators and beneficial insects.
Yes, and in fact, one of my desires and also skills is beekeeping. I've been a beekeeper for about 22 years now and got into that predominantly because of pollination for our fruit trees that we had all over our yard. And I was noticing the pollination decline. So, taking matters into my own hands, got into beekeeping, did a lot of research, joined the Santa Clara Valley Bee Guild, found out about beekeeping. And so that is part of what I do as an organic gardener.
Well, let's get into some specifics about growing blackberries. Talk about the difference between thorny and thornless blackberries as far as choosing the varieties. I think most people would probably lean towards the thornless, or at least have a good pair of sleeves to protect their arms. But is there a difference in taste or sweetness between thorny and thornless varieties?
Thorny and thornless are really a preference for the end user. Most people are acquainted with the blackberries from the Pacific Northwest, where you have the thick brambles, and those are loaded with spines. Now, that works well as a defense mechanism for animals. It doesn't work well for us when we're trying to pick those. So, really, it's a matter of preference, and there are varieties that are both thornless and thorned. you'll have to look into that and see what you can determine. As far as olali berries, I know that they have our kids refer to them as being spiny. They had little prickers on them. But as I said, there are a number of different varieties, and it's really the user who makes that determination of what works best for them.
It's actually one of the oldest and most popular varieties, the Olali, Ollalie, and it's a cross between a blackberry, a loganberry, and a youngberry. And it's a fairly large berry, too, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's large. It is incredibly tangy. It has sweetness to it. It's delightful for making jams. Berry cobblers are our specialty, and my wife Mary has perfected the recipe, and it's a frequent request when our kids come over to have berry cobbler, and we do a lot of freezing of those berries as well.
I know that the Sacramento Master Gardeners have some of their favorite varieties that they recommend highly. Things like Thornless Black Satin, Black Butte, and Marion. What are some good berries for the beginning berry grower to have in their yard?
One of the things to keep in mind about berries is that some people are intimidated. They have that notion that the brambles and they'll grow thick and they'll be overgrown and they'll get out of control. Well, that can happen. However, what to keep in mind is to be exploratory when it comes to garden. In other words, identify what may work for you and try and experiment with things. So, in terms of varieties, there are so many different varieties that are available in any of the nurseries or garden centers. And I would start with one of those. Predominantly, they are adjusted for our area. And Fred, as you identified it first, they will adapt to the area, the agricultural zone that we're in. It's number 9. And berries are well adapted to that environmental zone.
All gardening is local, so check with your local garden center and nursery person to find out about the best berry varieties to grow wherever you might live. Now, I know here in Central California, some of the recommended varieties include Navajo, Kiowa, and Primark, Freedom, and the Olali. And those are fairly early harvest dates on those varieties. That could be from late May all the way through June and early July. And then there are the later varieties that put on the biggest show of fruit in mid to late summer, like Marionberry and Chester. And I think that's something that most home gardeners who are getting into it should think about, that if you are buying 3 or 4 vines of blackberries, make sure that they have successive harvests so that you can have fresh blackberries from mid-spring to late summer. And the beauty is there are some varieties, aren't there, that will put on a second show in fall.
Yes, that's correct. And those, just a little bit of information and some language on berries. Berries are referred to as perennial plants in that they remain in the ground for years. Berry plants, blackberries specifically, and also raspberries, but we're talking about blackberries, can live for 15 to 40 years. They have great longevity and they will produce year after year, very reliable. You want to start with the soil and do some adequate soil preparation with lots of organic matter. And then as you place the canes in the ground, the roots, they will continue to put up what are referred to as primocanes and florocanes. The distinction, just language aside, is that the berry vines will grow long. They can grow up to 15 feet in a year. They will grow that first year. And in that first year, it's all about vegetative growth. And then the second year is what are referred to as the florocanes, the flowers, the blossoms, and the subsequent fruit. And then a little bit of cultural practices. You'll need to do some pruning in order to maintain those berries. And Fred, I want to mention a resource that is really helpful for growing caneberries, particularly in the Sacramento region, but can be broadly applied across the board. And that's one of our environmental horticulture notes through the UC system. And that is on our website that we can reference and provide a wealth of information about growing caneberries in Sacramento.
We will have a link to that very document in today's newsletter. That newsletter is entitled Growing Caneberries in the Sacramento Region, and we'll have a link to that in today's newsletter, along with a lot more information, too, about black raspberries, including some of the pictures that you kindly sent over that shows you doing something that makes a heck of a lot of sense if you're going to grow blackberries, and that's to trellis them.
Yes. Berries are, as I indicated, will grow up to 14 to 16 feet long. And so what you want to do is you want to provide a support. The predominant berry varieties that I have planted are referred to as trailing blackberries. In other words, if you do not support them, they will be lying on the ground. And what you want to do then is to encourage growth, and the ease of being able to pick is you need to trellis those on a triple wire system with in any number of ways that you can trellis blackberries.
Yeah, you were absolutely correct. When I first started off growing blackberries, I was just trailing them along a fence. It was basically just a ranch type fence, wooden fence that was 4.5 feet tall. And I had it lined with some hardware cloth to added more support as the berries grew. But they found that fence just a little too short for their taste, and they would tend to send runners out and about. And when we talk about trellising blackberries, I think that should be about 6 feet tall.
That's correct. And so what you want to do, I have placed 4x4s in cement at least 7 feet high, and then run wires across those. You can have a span of anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 feet. And then I run a 12 gauge wire that goes through those at intervals of 2 feet, 4 feet, and 6 feet. A
And
little
then
bit of research then on that, on how to maintain those and how to put them onto that trellis would be helpful in addition to having that trellis structure.
exactly. And as those plants are growing, you would be, I would imagine, tying them to those wires.
Yes. However, the a little bit of obstacle happens when you have successive generations of primocanes that are growing from the ground, and while at the same time you have the florocanes that are part of this structure on the trellis that are producing the blossoms and the berries. So you'll have to find a way to take those primocanes and move them to the side, usher them to the side as they're growing so that you can have access to your berry hedge for immediate access for picking and harvesting.
That brings us to the importance of pruning because you want those primocanes to become floricanes in year number 2. So if you're pruning off the branches that have produced fruit, you should mark those and to know which ones to take off at the end of the season. And then you can save the primocanes and trellis those up.
While it's true that you can mark them, you will be able to easily tell the distinction of the primocanes versus the florocanes. The distinction is this, is that the florocanes, when they're done producing in this, after you've done the harvest in June, July, August, they will begin to die back. And you can clearly see the distinction of the green primocane versus the aging brown fluorocane. What you'll do with those fluorocanes, once they produce, they're done. They're not going to do any more for the plant. So that's when you cut it off, those fluorocanes at the ground level. Once those are completely removed from your structure and trellis, then you can begin weaving those primocanes into that area of the trellis that is now available for your next year's crop.
Tell us about your personal protection system. What sort of gloves, what sort of sleeves, or what do you wear when you go out and deal with perhaps a thorny variety?
So when I'm dealing with thorny varieties, first I'm always in a long sleeve shirt for sun protection and my hat. And I wear leather gloves so that I can freely be working with the thorny varieties. I would be inclined, even with thornless, to wear gloves just as a form of protection when you're out in the garden and doing garden work.
I like my thorn resistant sleeves that I can put on either over a long sleeve shirt, or if I'm wearing a short sleeve shirt, just wear them as sleeves. They do a pretty good job of protecting you from getting pricked too often, but it's only partial protection. It's not full protection, but still it's better than nothing.
They do. I'm laughing right now because I'm thinking about our kids when they were younger. We started our kids when they were 6 years old and up, and we would go to Watsonville for berry picking. Inevitably, they would get prickers in their fingers, and they learned to accept that as part of the tasty treat. In order to harvest, you need to have some pain along the way. But the beauty is that the treat was better than anything that you might experience along the way.
All right. Yes, it's much more appreciated too.
It is.
Talk a little bit about spacing blackberry plants, because most gardeners' eyes are bigger than their tummies, and they tend to overplant and don't provide proper spacing. What is the preferred in-row spacing for blackberries?
So the in-row spacing is 3 to 4 feet apart per plant. The reason for that is because from that perennial plant, those roots that remain in the ground intact for years will produce up to 6 to 8 primocanes each year. So from that one root crown and that area, you will have these new primocanes, which, as we've talked about, will become the next generation, next year's berries. That's a lot of vines. And if you envision then that you have a 10-foot row and you spaced the maximum 4 plants from your garden center in that area, that will give you adequate harvest and abundant crops for years to come.
And if people want to try new varieties and add a second row of a trellised blackberry, I would think that second trellis should be pretty far apart from the first trellis, maybe 8 to 10 feet or so.
8 to 10 feet would be ideal, because what you want to do is you want to be able to capture the sun. You don't want one row eclipsing the sun from the other row. And you also want to be able to have greater access, to be able to get in and out. And keep in mind, you will have the primocanes that will be in that area on the ground. So you want to make sure that you have adequate space in between those rows.
And you will learn quickly to wear good, solid shoes when working on your blackberries as opposed to your flip-flops.
That's true. I always wear closed-toed shoes whenever I'm out in the garden, just as a regular precaution. However, I have seen people out in flip-flops working with berries. It's your personal preference. User beware.
How do you fertilize your blackberries?
I spend a lot of time with soil preparation prior to planting. It is pivotal and makes incredible difference in terms of the quality of your berries. So preparation before you plant is important. Enriching with compost, with organic matter is the way to go. However, that having been said, from year to year, I will use an acidic based fertilizer. The reason the acid based fertilizer is that blackberries prefer a pH around 5.6 to 6.5. Soils in the Sacramento area tend to be anywhere from 6 to 8. And having measured the pH of the soil, I know it tends to be in that very neutral range, which is 7. So I use an acidic fertilizer and I fertilize about 2 to 3 ounces per plant. And if you want to extrapolate that over your row, you can just do the math on that. And I use that and I apply the fertilizer both in the springtime, just as the flowers or the blossoms are coming out and the buds are coming out, and I also apply in the fall.
All right, so 2 applications a year.
Yes.
All right. I'm glad you stressed the fact that soil prep is so important. And you also mentioned that it's a perennial plant. So that means you get one chance to improve your soil, because once those plants are up, they're not going anywhere and you're not going to be able to rototill in that area. So
That's right.
get that soil started off right with a lot of good organic matter, the compost, worm castings. And I would think, too, that blackberries would prefer good drainage.
They do. They really need adequate drainage. The roots will go down 12 to 18 inches. You need to be aware if you are in an area of hard pan. If the hard pan is down 2, maybe 3 feet, it's best to break that up because you want well drained soil for your blackberries.
When I lived in the country, we had 2 layers of clay, a hard pan that we had to break through. And some of the old timers said, well, they won't let us do it anymore, but dynamite works great. But also the guy with the Jeep mounted auger drilling deep holes also solve the issue. Although dynamite would have been fun.
It would have.
Yeah. But no, apparently that's frowned upon in the 21st century. All right. We've talked fertilizing. How much water do they need?
Water is important for all living things, especially blackberries. The key time is once a week, but the key critical period is during the berry development. Because the fruit is predominantly water with all kinds of other sugars and nutrients added, it is concentrated in that berry. And so watering once a week deeply. How deeply? You need to, whatever your irrigation system that you use, you need to make sure that that water is percolating down to at least a foot into the soil. Now, that sounds deep, and it is. So you'll have to do some measurements of your soil along the way. Take a garden spade, take a shovel a little bit away from the crown of your berries and the roots, the tender roots. However, a way to see what is in the soil. There's also the method of taking your fingers, those fingers that you were given at birth are implements that we can use very effectively in the garden. And you scratch off the mulch, which we haven't talked about yet, Fred, in the importance of mulch, but we will. It has to do with pulling that mulch back and then digging down into the soil, maybe 3 to 4 inches, and see, is it dry? Is it friable soil? If so, it's time to water. But if you're on an interval of at least once a week deeply, then you're going to take care of your berries.
What methodology of watering do you like? I know that with raspberries, overhead watering is frowned upon because of the chance of spreading diseases. But what about blackberries?
Blackberries, the same thing, but blackberries in this area tend to be disease free. And yet that is still a preferred method of watering at the ground level. Not only is it better for the plant, it's also better for our environment with the reduction of waste of the water with evaporation. You want that water to percolate into the soil to have it accessible for the roots. So there are lots of different water. I do a lot of hand watering. There are inline emitters. There are hose systems. There are mini sprinklers. There are a variety of irrigation tools and techniques that are available. Talk to a garden center, talk to other gardeners about possible irrigation methods.
I would think that if you are using drip irrigation or even soaker hoses, you might run them along either side of the plants.
Yes, absolutely. You need to run them along either side, about 6 to 8 inches away from the root crown. You don't want to be watering right at the base of the plant. You want to be out in the area of the root zone.
Right, and it depends on your soil too. If you have a clay soil, you can put those lines a little bit further out. But if you have sandy soil, you might need to have 4 lines instead of 2 lines.
Yes, absolutely. I had just briefly mentioned that about mulch. Let me just address that in terms of soil health and longevity and development. Mulch is any material made, it can be inorganic, it can be rocks. However, preferred is an organic material, straw, leaves, compost, wood chips. Those are organic matter that can be placed on top to a thickness of 3 to 4 inches for preservation of the water in the soil. Also, it minimizes the growth of weeds, and it keeps your soil healthy because those the bacteria and the fungi from the soil will begin to break down that organic matter and incorporate that into the soil medium that's down below.
It keeps the weeds down. It feeds the soil. What's not to like about mulch? It's great.
It is. It's great, and it makes the surface look good. It was a strong misconception of mine that I learned as a young gardener, and that was I used to think that bare soil was beautiful and that that's the way that it's supposed to be. And then as in doing the research and being aware, it's you want to cover your soil. You want to take care of it. And by taking care of it, you're either planting something living green on within that soil, or you're mulching it to cover it up and to protect it and to nourish and enrich that soil.
And at this point, we should dissuade people about using a mulch such as black plastic or even weed cloth because you're just. I think if I die and go to purgatory, my punishment will be trying to rip out weed cloth located below berries.
That's very true. That's why I stress the organic mulches over the inorganic. Now, in production, they use the plastic sheeting. And when we used to head to the fields in Watsonville, we would see that. That works well for weed abatement and for watering and irrigation. However, it's not as soil friendly with regard to enriching that soil as would be an organic mulch.
Yeah, black plastic in a coastal area kind of makes sense for raising soil temperatures too, and
Yes.
keeping weeds down if you're in a commercial operation. But for the homeowner, black plastic or weed cloth, which is just a permeable sort of plastic that theoretically lets water and air through. And boy, that theory only lasts for about a year or so. You're better off with just saving your old leaves and chopping them up with your mower or your weed whacker and spreading them, like you say, 3 or 4 inches thick beneath your berry patch.
Absolutely. The neighbors know in this area when it's fall, expect to see Jeff in the clean green cart. I am gathering those leaves and then engaging in conversations with neighbors about what am I doing with these leaves and how am I going to apply them. So fall is a wonderful time of year.
Yes, my next door neighbor has a beautiful, huge oak tree, and I get all the leaves. I frequently will run out of the house when I hear the sound of a big chipper shredder down the street where there's some tree project going on, and ask if, hey, instead of taking that to the dump, you want to put it in my driveway? And more than often than not, they say yes.
I'm absolutely with you. And my heart goes pitter-patter, too, at the sound of a chipper, because I know that that's a free resource for mulch. There are many people who may go to a garden center to buy a couple of bags of mulch, and that's not a bad idea. And that is a resource that's available. Another resource is local tree trimmers. And as you indicated, they're more than likely to be able to drop off maybe a half a yard in your driveway so that you can spread mulch into all areas of your garden. Those wood chips are perfect for a soil topper.
And as you dig deeper into gardening, you realize that certain mulches benefit certain type of plants. And when it comes to our hardwood plants, like berries are, because they have a wooden stem, the preferred mulch that produces the preferred bacteria is the tree trimmings, the chipped and shredded tree parts. The wooden, basically, chips work very well for wooden plants, if you will, whereas for your annual plants that you pull out every year, you want a mulch that is perhaps more along their lines of being. That's where your compost pile comes in. If you've got a compost pile made up of your old annuals, that's the perfect food for mulch for your annual plants.
That is perfect mulch.
Hello, free subscribers. Welcome back to that infamous Beyond the Garden Basics podcast paywall. Well, paid subscribers do get a longer podcast, and in this edition, Master Gardener Jeff Smoker and myself talk more about blackberries, including info about some of the best written available information about growing blackberries, and it's free to download. Also, we talk about some possible issues that you might have with your blackberry plants, insects, diseases, or disorders, such as white druplet disorder, which is a very common occurrence here in the warm to hot areas of California, and it's in other states as well. In the newsletter, we'll have the links and sources for a lot of information we talked about, including charts for choosing blackberry varieties for an extended harvest, how to use the University of California's Integrated Pest Management's revised online device entitled the Plant Problem Diagnostic Tool, which can help take you step by step to identify your particular plant and what the problem looks like to help you pinpoint the cure for whatever ails your plant. Again, paid subscribers will have access to the complete podcast as well as the extra information, including a human-reviewed transcript, in the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter. Paid subscribers have access to a lot more, including a bonus newsletter each week with more garden tips for success. Paid subscribers also have access to previous editions of the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter, as well as priority in getting your garden questions answered. Beyond the Garden Basics subscriptions are reasonably priced as well. They're just $5 a month or $50 a year. Your support helps keep the newsletter and podcast alive. It helps keep me going as well. We are a demilitarized, politics-free newsletter because we want to be your happy place online. Join us. I appreciate your eyes and ears on the Beyond the Garden Basic newsletter and podcast. You can find it all on Substack.com. Thank you very much.